We're going to get started this morning. For those of you who have not been here and don't know me, my name is Brent. And in this quarter, in this class, we're talking about science versus evolution. And starting this week and going for the next couple of weeks, we're getting into genetics. A brief sort of backstory of where we've come. We've sort of been zooming in all quarter so far. We started in week 2 with a very broad look at things, and we looked at cause and effect, and we looked at the universe as the ultimate effect, and saying that the universe had to have an ultimate cause. We then zoomed in, and for the couple of weeks following that, looked at matter. Matter being just a subpart of the universe. We zoomed in and looked at matter, and we said, okay, how can matter pop into existence? Even if you could somehow find a way for the universe to exist out of nothing, you would still have to explain how matter popped into existence, and atheists can't. We then zoomed in after that, and last week we looked at life. Okay, so that's a subpart of matter. You have non-living material and you have living material. And we said, okay, even if you could somehow explain how the universe popped into existence, and even if you could somehow explain how matter popped into existence, you would still have to find a way of explaining how non-living matter became living matter. Starting this week and going into next week, we're going to zoom in one more time and look at genetics, which is sort of the information of life. And we've already looked at information in week 2, and we looked at life in week 5. This is sort of a combination of the two. How can we get genetic information, the information from life? And we've sort of already looked at, like we said, with information in life, put those two together. We really can't get genetic information from random chance. You can't get information from random chance. You can't get life from non-living materials. So the idea that you can get genetic information from random processes is kind of silly. We're going to sort of go throughout this next couple of weeks assuming original genetic information. Just granting that to them, assuming that it exists. Once we have original genetic information, which is itself impossible, how do we get more genetic information? Because that's what evolution requires at its core. It requires simple genetic information to get more complex. It requires very little genetic information to get more in volume. How can they go about adding genetic information to what already exists? What processes have we involved? What experiments have we run? What do we see in those experiments? And do those experiments line up with the atheistic worldview? That's where we're going with this. I'm beyond stoked about this. This is going to be so fun, especially if you're a nerd like me. To start out, we're going to define a couple of base-level genetic processes. What is microevolution, otherwise known by me as little e evolution?
Microevolution would be more along the lines of natural selection.
Okay, we'll get into natural selection in just a second. You're very close with that. Small changes. I like Christy's definition there. It's small variations or mutations in genetic code. Okay, and these small variations or mutations lead to minor differences between otherwise similar creatures. If you have a pair of parents that have 3 different offspring, they're siblings, they're very genetically similar, but they might have different height, different hair color, different body shape, different eye color, different skin tone, different proclivities to illnesses or baldness or all sorts of different things. That happens with microevolution. Small genetic changes that lead to minor differences between otherwise very similar creatures. What about natural selection? This should not be a trick question. What is natural selection? Do what? Survival of the fittest. That's what we most often hear from the topic of natural selection. And some Christians get scared by the prospect of natural selection because we so often hear about it in the context of atheistic evolution. We hear about it in that context, and so without a solid understanding of what it is, some Christians will just resort to rejecting it altogether. They hear natural selection and they go, oh no, that's Darwinism stuff, I don't believe in that. Right? But it's actually a perfectly valid scientific concept. It's the idea that because of those minor variations from microevolution, creatures will be able to perform slightly differently than other similar counterparts would in a similar environment. For example, Michael Phelps and I are very similar beings. Okay, we're both humans. We're, in terms of the whole animal kingdom, we're very similarly genetically made. But he is literally designed to be a swimmer. I am not. Okay, and so even though we're very similar, because of various microevolutionary changes, there are differences between him and I, and it allows him to perform very differently than I would in a pool of water. Okay? Even though he and I are similar, because of those slight variations, he is simply a way better swimmer than I am. And so, due to this random chance of microevolution, the variations will lead a creature to be more or less able to survive in whatever environment they find themselves in. They'll be less able to adapt to changing environmental conditions. So, natural selection, just to put a header on this slide, what is natural selection? Natural selection is simply the concept that the physical or potentially mental capabilities or the nature of a creature will systematically select which creature survives compared to other creatures. It's the survival of the fittest idea. A dog born with 3 legs is far less likely to survive than one born with 4. This is not rocket science. A fish with an abnormally small fin will be unable to swim as well as normal fish, and so it is far less likely to survive than a fish with standard fins.
Unless it's a lucky fin.
Unless it's a lucky fin, and then you just get sent to Australia. Over time, these differences in these creatures will stack up, and in theory, only the best genetics for a particular environment will survive and pass on to the offspring generations. My question is, does this show evolution? Does microevolution and natural selection show evolution? Because that's what it's been assumed. It's been assumed that the minor variations among species that we see from microevolution have been assumed by atheists, despite a complete and total lack of evidence, to be a small part of the much larger picture of macroevolution, molecules to man evolution, or big E evolution, if you want to use my terminology. Evolution, like macroevolution, goes beyond just variation among species or within a certain species. It's variation between species. It's not just humans sticking within human boundaries and then just being different humans. It's monkeys becoming different and becoming more different and adding genetic information and adding capabilities and being able to use their thumbs and losing that ability in their feet somehow and changing genetic information until they're so different from monkeys that they're now humans. Okay? There's natural selection and microevolution, which is variation within a species. Macroevolution is variation between species, from one species to another. And it's just been assumed that microevolution and natural selection can explain variation from one species to another. But that's not necessarily what the evidence dictates. For decades after Darwin, natural selection was and has been one of the only methods that atheists have had to explain macroevolutionary change. But I want us to think about what natural selection cannot do. And this is a very important distinction that I think we need to make, that there's a massive assumption here that's being made by the atheists that is not logical and has not been supported by the evidence. And if you're basing your entire worldview on what you can support with the scientific evidence, you should probably not make this massive assumption. Okay? Natural selection is based entirely on the current genetic information present in a creature. The existing genetic code then determines the creature's probability of survival. Okay? Natural selection is entirely incapable of producing new genetic information. That's simply, not only is it not capable, it's simply not what the concept is about at all. It's not even remotely what the concept is about. And this idea is widely recognized today, even by evolutionists. This is Hugo de Vries. He's an evolutionist and a geneticist, and he said simply that natural selection may explain the survival of the fittest, but it cannot explain the arrival of the fittest. Natural selection and microevolution can't explain where genetic code came from in the first place. But even once you have genetic code, like in monkeys, it can't explain how you add genetic code to get to humans, and then from humans, then you can survival of the fittest it. But you can't explain the gap between the monkeys and the humans using this. Cool. According to evolutionists, though, what does natural selection have to do? Right? Again, based upon absolutely no evidence that's even capable of doing so, most people in the scientific community have forced natural selection to bear the entire weight of inventing all new genetic information to go from the simple single-celled organism to where we are as humans. Simply put, as we have known since the dawn of genetic research, as creationists have always held to, and now that even evolutionists agree to, that's simply not how genetics work. Genetics works, whatever the plural should be there. I trust the slides. Natural selection cannot create any new information. It can only use what was already there. And so because of this, many in the evolutionary community have turned to genetic mutations as the source for new genetic material. Okay? So what about genetic mutations? Genetic mutations are when, during a reproductive cycle, the genetic code of an offspring is fundamentally changed, leading to drastic differences from parent to child. And the basic evolutionary argument is that the genetic mutations and the resulting differences can explain the addition of new information to the genome, because you would have, say, whatever genetic code you had in the parent, and then as the offspring is being made, the genetic code is altered or changed in some fundamental way, and so the genetic information in the child would be new or different compared to what was in the parent. Okay, so genetic mutations, in theory, can explain the introduction of new genetic information that wasn't previously there. In theory. The new information would not have been in the parent's DNA. It would only be produced when the genetic code mutated in the reproductive cycle. Okay? But there are several issues with this, that they're making genetic mutations do what genetic mutations simply cannot do. First of all, with genetic mutations, let's just recognize there's no explanation for the original source of genetic information. Once you have genetic information, even if genetic mutations can explain new information, it can't explain the origin of that original information. So they're still left with a massive problem that they can't solve. Okay? But let's assume, like we're going through this class, we're assuming original genetic information. How do we get additional genetic information from there? Unfortunately, genetic mutations can't do that either. There's still no real explanation of the creation of new information, even when that genetic information already exists. Just like with natural selection, genetic mutations cannot explain the creation of new genetic material, only the alteration of the current genetic material present in a creature. Genes are built and designed to allow variation within a species within a very narrow limit. Okay? Your genetic code can mutate, but you're never going to mutate without being a human still. Okay, you might be a deformed human, you might have illnesses or cancer or other things because your genetic code mutates, but you're still going to be a human because the mutations cannot go outside of very well-defined limits. Okay? Mutations can produce a minor variety within a species, but according to the scientific evidence available, mutations are simply not able to produce enough variation within a species to take that species and create a new life form from it. Simply not how genetic mutations works. And we'll see that now with a fantastic genetics analogy. I want us to think about genetics as a human instruction manual, like physical written books. And we can think of nucleotides as being letters. And we can think of clusters of nucleotides as being words. And those clusters of nucleotides form genes, and so those words can form sentences and chapters, and then those chapters combine and form volumes or books, which would be genes combining to form chromosomes. Chromosomes combine to form the whole genome, which would be the entire library of the human genetic instruction manual. What would happen if we tried to create a copy? Spoiler alert, it's up there. If we tried to create a copy of the genetic code library, errors would inevitably occur. Okay? As we're copying one book to another, we might miss a comma. We might misspell a word. Okay? And spell check might not check that. Variations from the original instruction manual would inevitably occur. And they can come in several forms. Individual words could be jumbled. Okay, words might be misspelt. The words might be sort of in word scramble form. Duplication could occur, where words or sentences are mistakenly copied more than once right after each other. Translocation could occur, where words or sentences from one part of one of the books are incorrectly copied to another part of another one of the books. Deletion could also occur, where parts of the instruction manual are just not copied at all, and so the information is completely lost. When these genetic mutations or when these errors in the copying process occur, no additional instructions are being added to the manual. No new information is being created. No additional instructions are added to the manual. But unfortunately for evolutionists, they require that new sentences, chapters, and even whole books be mistakenly written each time a new creature comes on the scene. So that would have had to happen thousands of times across the history of the evolutionary timeline. With each new creature that we go from one step to another in the evolutionary chain, brand new instructions would have had to have been mistakenly written from these errors in this copying process. Go for it.
The larger the genetic mutation, the more likely it is to be harmful too. So when you have
We'll get into harmful genetic mutations, I promise.
It's very likely to be very bad.
Very likely to be very, very bad. There's simply no world where one can reasonably argue that these kinds of errors can add information to an instruction manual, let alone to have mistakenly done it thousands of times. Okay? And that's kind of what we see. There's an entropic reality in genetics research. What's fascinating about this instruction manual analogy is we can look at what actually happens when these mutations occur. So I'm going to have a sentence up on the screen. Does that sentence make sense? This should not be a trick question. I know it's early. Have y'all had your coffee? Does this sentence make sense?
Yes.
Cool. Absolutely not. Let me read it to you. Jane picked up the ball. It's simple. You get it now? Cool. But what happens when we add some of those errors in the copying process? Let's copy this sentence and let's look at what happens when there's errors. Does this sentence make sense? Jane up pi Jane te. Does that make sense at all? If you say it does, I'm gonna slap you.
The period's there.
The period's there, right? We got one of the, we got several things right. Let's look at what actually happened. We had Jane, and we copied Jane correctly, and we also just copied and translocated Jane over here. We had picked, and we lost the CK, but we kept the PI and the ED, and it got copied here. Up just got translocated over here. The got scrambled, and then ball was just lost entirely. This is an extreme example of genetic errors in the copying process. But over time, various genetic mutations and the mistakes in the copying process would stack up, and we would go from a sentence that makes complete sense at the dawn of time to now what we actually have in human genetic code. We're seeing a downward trend in genetics. With each new generation of life forms, the original, closer to perfect genetic code is becoming more disjointed and more nonsensical with each new generation. That problem only gets bigger the longer your timeline is. Okay, so if we've been here for 14.2 billion years instead of just 6,000, we should have completely nonsensical genetic code by now.
Okay, so maybe I'm confused with it.
Go for it.
I've done horrible genetics in science.
Okay.
So like, I'm very ignorant, right? In music, there's 7 notes-ish, right?
Yeah.
So if I take a chorus to a song and I move notes around, I create a new song, but it's still using the same building blocks, right?
Yes.
So why would changing or adding things not just make something different? Why would it destroy what we have? Right? Because like that would be the creation of something new.
Right. So let's go with the music analogy. If you have an F major chord,
right,
you have F, A, and C.
Mm-hmm.
If you change some of those notes around and you play A, B flat, and B, is that going to work?
No.
No. So by taking what you had that did work and changing it around slightly, all of a sudden you've taken something that sounded really pretty and really consonant, and you've taken something it doesn't work. Why are we playing this? It's the same building blocks,
okay,
but by jumbling around, it breaks.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And if you've got a chord progression or a melody that you're trying to follow, and you start changing pieces around, it breaks the flow and the pattern that's created.
Right.
Okay. I follow that. That
Yep.
works. Cool.
Music is also designed intentionally.
Yes. Which is why I picked it as a complimentary analogy, because
For the most part.
I
We're
was
not
just-
getting into that rabbit hole. We're not getting into that rabbit hole. I could get into that rabbit hole. We're not going to. The problem with this, though, is that genetic mutation and natural selection and this variation that we do see from each new generation of offspring and the mutations that happen, they're scientific realities. And so there's a startling trend in genetics, and it's one that completely contradicts the basic assumption of evolution, where we should start with simple DNA and simple genetic information, and not only get more genetics and more information as life progresses, but the information that we have should be getting more complex and more cool in and of itself. Okay? And this is not what we see at all in our study of genetics. getting into what Jonathan was saying earlier, mutations can be classified into 3 basic categories. There's beneficial mutations, where a mutation would give an offspring a new trait that they otherwise would not have possessed, leading to an easier or more effective life for that organism, such as Michael Phelps. He had variations in his genetics that made him swim better than I can swim. Okay? That's a benefit to him. Then there's harmful genetic mutations, which is the same thing, except for it's a mutation that gives the offspring a new trait that makes life harder for the organism, such as a severe food allergy. Okay? What otherwise was just delicious food, now is trying to kill you. And so you have to be very careful with what you consume. And then there are neutral genetic mutations. And these are mutations that cause nearly or actually no effect on the organism's function, such as hair color. I don't care if you're a blonde or a brunette or a redhead or you're bald. That's not going to really change how you as an organism function in any meaningful way. Okay? That would be a neutral mutation. Neutral mutations are the most common in terms of the genetic research that we see, but they're completely irrelevant to our evolutionary discussion because a neutral mutation leads to no progress towards a new creature. A monkey that goes from brown fur to slightly lighter brown fur is no closer to becoming a human. It could just as easily, the next generation, go to black fur or go back to the more dark brown fur that it was originally. It's making no progress with a neutral mutation to becoming a human. Once we remove all neutral mutations from the equation and we look at just what's left, of all the other mutations, 99% plus, over 99% of the remaining genetic mutations are harmful. Several prominent atheist, evolutionist scientists have conducted a study, several of them actually. One of them in 1998 found that the odds of just one beneficial mutation occurring is roughly 1 in a million. A study done a few years following that found that the odds are actually so small they're difficult to estimate. It's so unlikely that there's going to be a beneficial mutation, they can't really pinpoint the probability for it. So when you sum up all of the beneficial, all of the neutral, and all of the harmful mutations together, there is a sharp downward trend in the overall genetic information present in the animal kingdom. And again, this completely contradicts the basic evolutionary idea that we're getting more complex. As an interesting side note, even in the very rare case where there is a positive outcome from a mutation, that tends to not be a gain of new information, but actually still a loss of existing information. For example, if you have a fish that has a really bulky top fin, that would make it harder for that fish to swim. If there's a genetic mutation when that fish has a kid, and the kid fish loses that bulky top fin, or it grows smaller, that's not a gain of new information that makes life easier for the fish. That's a loss of existing information that happens to benefit the offspring fish. Okay, so even when there is a beneficial mutation, that's still a loss of existing information, not a gain of new information. Okay? But remember, what we're trying to get at is how do we get from the basic original genetic information that we started with, that we're assuming, which it shouldn't exist, but let's just assume that it exists, how do we get from the basic original genetic information to the more and more complex genetic information that we see? Even when it's a beneficial mutation, it's still a loss of information. So we're still going backwards in that argument. This is geneticist John Sanford. He was at one point an atheist and then came to his senses and became a Christian. And he said this, that the degeneration of the genome is the precise antithesis of the evolutionary theory. The reality of genetic entropy is positively fatal to Darwinism. Darwinism is not just implausible, it's not just unlikely, it's absolutely dead wrong. But they have to try and get around this. If natural selection and genetic mutations are insufficient to explain the addition of new genetic information as they require, they have to somehow account for the additional genetic information that we see. They've got to find some other way of doing it. And beyond that, they have to find some way to account for the increasing complexity of the genetic information that is then added on. How does the genetic information allegedly get more and more complex. They have to find other ways of adding genetic information to what is already existing. And now we get to find out how they try and do that. The first way we've actually already looked at, and the first theory they have is with duplications. Like we've already stated, duplications are when in the copying process in a reproductive cycle, a particular strand of DNA, or sometimes portions of a whole strand, can be copied more than once, resulting in duplicated information in the new gene compared to the original. Okay? Under a very technical definition, duplications in the genetic code do actually result in additional information being added to the genome. Okay? Sometimes, like if it's the whole strand that's copied more than once, you're literally getting twice as much genetic information in the offspring as you had in the parent. Does this solve the atheist problem? This is not a trick question. Hopefully y'all know by now it does not solve the atheist problem. Unfortunately for the atheist, the practical effect of duplications is not what they need in order to have additional information to be added to the genome. There are several problems with this theory. Stanford scientists Shun Lin and Jonathan Pritchard highlighted this fact when they found that duplicated genes actually tend to be functionally redundant, susceptible to degradation until one of the copies is reduced to what they've termed a pseudo gene. So let's think about how this would actually play out. Let's say that genes were represented by my hand. Okay, this is a cool little gene. And let's say that the parent had this gene, and this gene serves a purpose. Let's say it serves the purpose of just standing up here like this. Okay, if I reproduce, and then in the offspring there's a duplicated gene, so now the offspring has two hands. Well, I only needed one. So this one's going to do exactly what it did, and then this one's just going to kind of sit here. And it's going to sit here, and it's going to become useless. And it actually degrades to a point that if somehow this gene were to die, or this gene were to get removed for whatever reason, this hand can no longer actually fulfill the function that it was originally designed to do. The duplicated portion of the gene ends up becoming functionally redundant, unable to fulfill its original purpose. And so it's there, but it's only kind of a pseudo-gene. Okay? So, technically, sure, there's additional information in the offspring, because there's literally twice as much as there was before. But the duplicated gene is rendered useless at best. Duplications do very little to explain how new genetic information can be added to the creature's genes, at least useful information being added to the creature's genes. Not only that, but the additional information that was duplicated is simply a copy of the existing genetic information in the creature. It's not new genetic information. Just because I have two hands instead of one doesn't mean that there's any new shape. It's still a hand. I just have two now, and one of them is redundant. There's no new genetic information. It's just a copy of what was already there. Even beyond that, duplications actually make the genetic situation worse off overall. Genetic duplications often create chaos, resulting in disruption of an otherwise functioning gene rather than evolutionary progress. Genetic duplications often create chaos, resulting in disruption of an otherwise functioning gene rather than evolutionary progress. So as an example of what duplications cause, I'm going to repeat this sentence again with some duplications. Genetic duplications often create chaos, resulting in disruption of an otherwise functioning gene. Question. Was there any new information in this second sentence that wasn't already in the first sentence? No. Same words. They're just some of them copied more than once. Was the second sentence easier to read? No. Significantly harder. Why? Because the duplications created chaos, resulting in a disruption of an otherwise functioning sentence, rather than progress to a new sentence. This is John Sanford again, and he said that it is widely recognized that duplication, whether in a written text or within the living genome, destroys information. Rare exceptions may be found where a duplication is beneficial in some minor way, though it still does not add information to the genome, but this does not change the fact that random duplications overwhelmingly destroy information. Duplications are not the atheist solution to new genetic information. But this might be. Anybody want to take a stab at what that word is? I don't blame anybody for not immediately jumping on it. I had to look it up and practice like 7 times, huh? Polyploidization. You're better than I am. Okay. Polyploidization. It's a crazy word. And in order to understand what this crazy word is, we need to understand how normal genetic reproduction works in a mature fashion. DNA is stored in chromosomes. Okay, and as humans, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And these pairs can be of the same type of chromosome or of different chromosomes, and the combination of each pair determines several characteristics of your personal, individual, unique genetic makeup. Okay? In a reproductive cycle, one chromosome from each of those pairs is chosen and copied to be passed on to the offspring. Okay? And that would look something like this. We have parent A or parent 1, depending on whether I choose to use numbers or letters, and we have parent 2 or parent B. And in a reproductive cycle, randomly from a single pair of chromosomes, one of them is chosen and copied, and then that copy is passed on to the offspring. So from both parents, one chromosome from each of the 23 pairs is copied, passing one chromosome from each of the 23 pairs to the offspring, resulting in the offspring having 23 pairs of chromosomes. Okay? And the random nature of the selection of these chromosomes to be passed, as well as the variety of different types of chromosomes that can exist in each pair, results in the very common occurrence where otherwise similarly genetically comprised siblings, that's a fun phrase to say, similarly genetically comprised siblings can have drastically different height, hair color, eye color, body shape, and a host of other genetic differences. Okay? Because if for one sibling, this chromosome and this chromosome were chosen, and then for another sibling, this chromosome and this chromosome were chosen, that's going to be a different genetic makeup for otherwise genetically similar siblings. Polyploidization works slightly differently in that instead of just copying one chromosome from each parent, the parent instead actually chooses the entire chromosomal makeup and copies both pairs of their chromosomes to pass off to the offspring. So we have the same situation as we had before, where parent A and parent B have 23 pairs of their chromosomes, and instead of just copying the one chromosome from each pair, they actually copy both. And it can be one parent or both parents here, resulting in either 3 or 4 sets of 23 chromosomes in the offspring. That's polyploidization. And it's most often seen in plants, but it has been observed to happen in animals as well. But is this the solution? Does this add genetic information? No, I see a lot of shaking heads. That makes me so proud. Y'all are learning so well. Technically, yes. Technically, it does add information for the creature, because the creature is only supposed to have, let's back up, it's only supposed to have 2. So if a creature is only supposed to have 2 and it has 4, that's by definition more information than it otherwise should have. But is it relevant? This is where we shake our heads no. Why is it not relevant?
Just like the analogy you gave earlier, one hand's meant to be raised up and the other one's also made to be raised up, and the other one's kind of pointless.
Well, and then beyond that, it might be additional information for the one creature, because the one creature is only supposed to have 2, and it has 4. That's literally twice as much information. And having additional chromosomes can actually lead to different effects than just duplicated genes. But there's no new information that didn't already exist in the parents. And that's key. Because that's what evolution requires. Evolution requires additional genetic information as we move from parent to offspring, and that additional information to stack up over time. But if all we have here with polyploidization is whatever existed in the parents just pooled together, that's not new information, that's just a pooling of existing information. It might be more than what it should be, but it's not new. We already answered that. Polyploidization does not give the new genetic information that is required to go from one evolutionary step to the next. A surplus of monkey genetics does not get us any closer to making a human. We just have more monkey genetics. If monkey number 1 and monkey number 2 make monkey number 3, and monkey number 3 has 1.5 or 2 times as many genetic informations that it needs to make a monkey, then that means that, at best, it makes a monkey really well. It doesn't tell anything about how that monkey could make a human.
Well, and also it adds more complexity, which we see statistically leads to more more problems and more degradation of the genome.
Significantly more problems. And that's actually what we're going to get to now. Because ironically, no, you're good. Ironically, it's actually just worse than not getting us any closer. It actually gets us not really farther away, but it's just beyond irrelevant. Because polyploids, which is polyploidization, polyploids is a creature that has had polyploidization happen to it. Polyploids can only reproduce with genetically similar creatures. Meaning, if you don't have just 2 chromosomes, but you have 3, you can only reproduce with another creature that also has 3. So in the rare random chance that you happen to be a polyploid, you can only reproduce with another polyploid. And if that other polyploid happens to be 4, you can't reproduce. Because of the technical process behind the selection of which chromosomes are passed on, polyploids are almost always reproductively isolated, meaning that they can only be compatible with other individuals in the population with a similar chromosomal makeup, and that leads to them actually having a net zero effect on the population. In the very rare instance where an animal is a polyploid, this actually tends to manifest in that animal being infertile and unable to pass along any of their genes, whether or not it's new information that they have or just a pooling of existing information. They can't pass any of it on. But most plants, like we said, are polyploids. But most plants can reproduce asexually, meaning they can just essentially clone themselves. Because we're not going to get into how that works. Let's go with it here. They can essentially clone themselves. They don't have to find a compatible counterpart. They can just clone themselves. So regardless of whether a sterile animal or a self-cloning plant, the net effect of polyploidization tends to be that any additional information that they might have is completely isolated from the overall population. And if it's isolated, it has a net zero effect on the population. Does that get us any closer to evolutionary change? It might not get us farther away, but polyploidization, while it might look great, doesn't actually get us any closer to where we want to be. We have time for probably one more section. Epigenetics.
I mean, like 2 minutes at the end of class.
Cool. So we have time for one more section quickly. Epigenetics. Break this word down for me into epi and genetics. We've been talking about genetics the whole time. Anybody know what the prefix epi means? It's a Greek prefix. If you've heard the word epistala.
I know what epic is.
Epic, very close. Epi is on or over. So epistala being on paper. So an epistle is a letter.
Oh.
Okay? Epi being on or over. So epigenetics, we'll go quickly. Epigenetics being on or over genetic change. Changes that happen from one generation to the next that occur above or outside the actual genetics of a creature. That's what epigenetics are. It's not really genetic change, but it's change from a parent to an offspring that sort of skirts around the genetic issue that they somehow think will feed back into the genetic code. I don't really understand it, but this is one of the answers that they have to seek an answer to how we get new genetic information in the genetic code. In 2013, a study was done on mice. They had a cherry blossom smell introduced, and when that smell was introduced, they had an electric shock applied to their feet. And they had this over and over and over. And so over time, the mice became fearful of a cherry blossom smell, whether or not the shock was present. Okay, they would just smell the cherry blossom, and they would just become fearful. Okay? The mice's offspring were then studied, and they were also found to be fearful of cherry blossom smell, despite never having experienced any shock treatment themselves. And in fact, their reaction actually seems to be stronger than the original mice's reaction because it occurred with much smaller amounts of the smell and induced a much stronger reaction in those mice, indicating that the conditioning was actually stronger in the offspring despite never having actually had the shock treatment. Does this show evolution? No. Well, that's, I think, a decent enough place to stop. We'll figure out why this is not showing evolution next week. Hopefully y'all will be back for that. And if any questions or anything else before we close, comments, questions, concerns, points of confusion, things I can clarify, then with that, I'll give you a minute back.